Hello, library friends in American Fork. My name is Donald Davis. I'm a storyteller, and I'm making this video from my home in North Carolina where I live. I do get to come out to Utah at least once a year for the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival, and often I get to come more than that and tell stories in schools. I've told stories all over the Alpine School District, and no matter where you go to school in the Alpine School District, I may have been to your school and we may have met. Several years ago, I wrote a book. It's called Jack and the Animals. And I wrote this book in order to preserve a story that my grandmother used to tell me when I was a little boy. So you see, I didn't make up this story. It's a story that I heard again and again and again from my grandmother. I didn't want the story to get lost, so I wrote the story, and then my friend Kitty Harville drew the pictures. Kitty lives in Arkansas, and we put it together and made the book. But what I want to do today is I want to tell you about how I heard the story from my grandmother, and then I want to tell you the story. Because when you look at the book, we had to just fit a really short version into the book, and the whole story is bigger and different than that. And if you learn to tell this story, don't try to memorize words. Just see it like pictures in your head and then tell it with your own words. And it might be short, it might be long, but it will be your story, and nobody else would tell it the way you do. So when I was a little boy, I grew up in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. If you look up the Great Smoky Mountains National Park online, and you look at pictures of log houses and log cabins in that park, that's just like the house my grandmother lived in and the house where my mother grew up when she was a little girl. So even though we lived in town, whenever we would go visit my grandmother, we would go way back in the mountains to a big log house, and that's where she lived. I had lots of cousins who lived nearby, and sometimes in the summer when school was out, my grandmother would invite me and maybe my little brother Joe to come spend a whole week with her. And sometimes when we got there, some of our cousins would be there also. Maybe my cousin Kay, maybe my cousin Andy, maybe there would be 4 of us there for the week, and that was lots of fun. When I heard this story, maybe I was, say, 8 years old. My cousin Kay was 9 years old. Kay's little brother Andy was 7 years old. My little brother was 6 years old. We heard it more than one time, so I heard it over a number of different years until it so soaked into my brain that I could just see the story and tell it to you without even thinking about any of the words in the story. So maybe in the summertime, we would go out there to spend the week. And at the end of the day, my grandmother might say, "Children, what would you think if we would go up on the mountain and build a fire and cook our supper tonight?" We always loved to do that. So my grandmother would get a little paper bag and she would put some eggs in it. The eggs came from her own chickens right out there in the chicken house. She would get another bag and she would wrap up in paper and put in that other bag maybe some sausage or some bacon, often some sausage, and it would have come from a pig that she had raised, and she made the sausage. Then she would get some leftover biscuits from breakfast, maybe put them in another little bag, and then she would get a big black frying pan. I actually have that frying pan to this day. It's right in there in the kitchen in this very house. And she would get some matches, and we would all carry something, and we would go way past the barn where the cows lived. We would go way past the cow pastures. We would go way up in the woods, way up on the mountain. And then my grandmother would say, "Gather up sticks, find some sticks, find some sticks." And we would pick up, what are we picking up sticks for, do you think? Ah, yes, to build a fire. There was a big rock there, and the rock had a crack in the middle. And we would build the fire in that crack, and then that big black frying pan could sit right across that fire, and we could cook our supper in it. Then when we got the fire going, she would crumble up the sausage into the frying pan. She would break the eggs into the frying pan. She would take a fork she brought, and she would scramble the eggs and the sausage all up together, and when it was all cooked, we would all get a biscuit, and we would take turns. We would just share the same fork. We would pass it around and around, and we would get bites, and we would eat the eggs and the sausage along with their biscuits. And we had a big supper. And sometimes she would even bring marshmallows, and we would roast marshmallows after we ate the rest of our food. You know what we'd do after that? We wouldn't go back to our house yet. No, no, no. Because we were waiting to see the sunset. And while we were waiting, we would build up the fire. And then sometimes my grandmother would say, "Children, do you want me to tell you a story?" And my brother and my cousin Andy and I would say, "Tell us about Jack. Tell us about Jack." And even my cousin Kate liked to hear about Jack. So here's a story about Jack that my grandmother used to tell us over and over again. It wasn't the only story she told about Jack. There were lots of stories about Jack, but this was one of our favorite ones. Now, Jack was a little boy. He had two big brothers. His oldest brother's name was Tom. Tom was grown up, and he had gone off in the world to seek his fortune, and he must have found it because he didn't come back home. And then there was another middle brother. His name was Will. And Will had grown up, and he had gone off in the world to seek his fortune, and he must have found it because he just never did come back home. And then there was Jack. You know what Jack's mama called him? She called him my baby. Jack was his mama's baby. Well, one day Jack came to his mama and he said, "Mama, you know, I'm old enough now. I think it's time for me to go seek my fortune." And Jack's mama said, "Well, Jack, you know, that's probably a good idea because I won't always be around to take care of you, and you need to go learn how to take care of yourself. But be sure to come back and visit me so I'll know that you're doing just fine and you're happy and you found your fortune." So Jack's mama packed him up a little bit of food to have something to eat for a day or two while he went to look for his fortune. And the next morning, he kissed her goodbye and he said, "Now, when I find my fortune, I'll come back to see you." And Jack started off down the road. Now, there was only one problem. Jack was going to look for his fortune, but he didn't know what a fortune was. All he knew was his brothers went to look for their fortune, and they must have found it, and he always wanted to do everything his brothers did. Now, wait a minute. I'll bet you know, and I'll bet I know, a fortune, it could be a lot of things. A fortune could be a lot of money, couldn't it? Yep, it sure could be. A fortune could be a lot of diamonds and gold and jewels. Could be. But you know, a fortune even could be a job, or a fortune could be a big adventure. But Jack didn't know any of that. He just knew he was going to look for something called a fortune, but he had no idea what he was looking for. So here he went down the road. He was looking on one side. He was looking on the other side. He was looking up in a tree. He thought, "I wonder what a fortune looks like. I guess when I find it, I guess I'll know that that's it." All of a sudden, Jack heard a terrible, terrible sound. Something was going. Jack thought, "Oh, what a terrible sound. That sounds like a cow crying." And he went around behind the barn where he heard that sound, and there stood an old cow, and tears were running down her face. She was just crying. And Jack said to that cow, "What's the matter with you? Why are you crying so much?" And the cow said, "I'm so old. I don't give milk anymore. They're talking about getting the milkman to come, and I'm afraid they're going to make me into hamburgers." Jack said, "You will not like being made into hamburgers. Why don't you come with me?" The cow said, "Well, where are you going?" Jack said, "I'm going to seek my fortune." And the cow said, "What's a fortune?" And Jack said, "I don't know, but it's better than turning into hamburgers." So here they go down the road. Let's see who's here. There's Jack and the cow. Right. They're going along, going along, going along, and pretty soon they hear an awful sound. Something is going. Jack says, that sounds like a dog crying. And they look under the porch of an old house, that's where the sound's coming from. And there is a dog with tears running down its dog face. It's crying. And Jack says to the dog, come out, come out. What's wrong with you? And the dog says, I'm so old, I can't tell one person from another. And when the robbers came, I licked them and let them in the house. And then when the people who live here came home, I bit one of them. They're going to put locks on the door and get rid of me for sure. Jack said, then you shouldn't stick around here. Why don't you come go with us? The dog said, well, where are you going? Jack said, we're going to seek our fortune. And the dog said, what's a fortune? Jack said, I don't know, but it's better than sticking around here now, isn't it? So down the road they go. Let's see who's here. There's Jack and the cow and the dog. Now they haven't gone very long before they hear a mournful, terrible sound. Something is going meow, meow, meow. Jack thinks, that sounds just like a cat crying. And they look up in a tree, he and his two animal friends, and up in that tree, there's an old cat with tears just dripping down. And Jack says, what's the matter with you? And the cat says, I'm so old. I can't catch mice anymore. They're going to buy mousetraps and they're just going to get rid of me. Jack says, well, don't stay around here. Come go with us. The cat said, where are you going? Jack said, well, guess what? We're going to seek our fortune. And the cat said, what's a fortune? And Jack said, I don't know, but it's better than staying around here. So the cat came down out of the tree, and down the road they go. Let's see. There's Jack and the cow and the dog and the cat. How many is that? Oh, that's 4, right. Would you believe they haven't gone very far till they hear another terrible sound? Something is going, oh, 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 oh. And Jack thinks, you know, that sounds like a crying donkey. Could it be? And they walk around behind a haystack. That's where the noise is coming from. And there, with tears dripping off its nose, is an old crying donkey. Jack says, why are you crying so much? And the donkey says, I'm so old. I can't do work anymore. I can't pull a little wagon. Nobody can ride me. They're gonna buy a tractor and they're gonna send me to the glue factory. Jack said, you will not like the glue factory. Why don't you come and go with us? Well, the donkey said, where are you going? Jack said, oh, that. We're going to seek our fortune. And the donkey said, what's a fortune? And Jack said, I don't know, but it's got to be better than the glue factory. So down the road they go. Let's see. There's Jack and the cow and the dog and the cat and the donkey. There's 5 of them. Wow. You know, by now, it is almost dark. And just as the sun's going down, they hear another horrible sound. Something is going, and Jack thinks, could it really be what it sounds like? Could it really be a crying rooster? And do you know, they look up on the roof of a barn That's where the sound's coming from. And sure enough, there stands a rooster with tears dripping off its beak. Jack says, "What's wrong up there?" And the rooster says, "I'm so old, I can't tell time anymore. Was the sun going up or coming down? I crow in the morning to wake people up, and I don't crow at night. And it's all mixed up, it's all mixed up." Jack says, "I think you better come go with us, because I'm afraid something bad might happen to you if you stay around here." So the rooster comes down, and here they go down the road. Now, let's not lose anybody because it's getting dark. So we've got, first of all, Jack and the cow and the dog and the cat and the donkey and the rooster. Let's see. How many animals? Oh, only 5. How many boys? Only 1. How many in all? 6. Now, they haven't gone very far, and it is so dark, they're having to be sure they kind of touch each other, so nobody gets lost, and then there's trouble. The cow says, "I'm hungry. I'm hungry." And the cat says, "Meow, where are we going to sleep?" And the dog says, "Ruh, ruh, ruh. I need some food. I need some food." And the rooster goes, "Ruh, ruh, ruh, where are we going to roost for the night?" And the cow then goes, "I'm really starving." Jack thinks, "Oh no, I got to find a place for us to sleep. I got to feed all these animals." And they're going along while he's thinking about it. And way ahead in the woods, they see a little tiny light. And they go toward that light in the dark, And when they get closer and closer, they see it's a little light in the window of a little tiny house in the woods. A light like maybe a candle's burning inside. And they go up on the porch, and they knock on the door, and and nobody comes to the door. So they go down to the window, and they look in the window, and sure enough, there are 2 candles burning on a table. And do you know, that table is covered with food like somebody just finished eating dinner, and they left all the rest of the food right there on top of the table, and they went somewhere. And then Jack starts looking around inside that little house. That whole little house just had 1 room. And you know what he saw over in one corner? He saw sacks full of money. And he looked over in another corner, and he saw boxes full of silver and gold. And he looked over in another corner, and there were bags of diamonds and jewels. And in the last corner, he saw boxes and boxes and boxes full of brand new toys that had not even been opened, and nobody played with them. And you know what Jack said to those animals? He said, "I think this must be a robber's hideout. Who else would have money and gold and silver and diamonds and jewels and toys hidden in a little house in the woods unless they were robbers?" Then Jack said, "You know, that food sure does smell good. And if they were robbers, they probably stole it from somebody else. So if we go in and eat some of their food, I know it'll be okay." And the door was open. It wasn't locked. They opened the door and they went inside, and everybody ate all the food they wanted, and they even started to settle down for a nap. When all of a sudden, they hear this horrible noise coming through the woods. Kablam, kablam, hey ho, whoa, yeah ho. It's the robbers coming home. And Jack looks out the window and he says, "Oh my goodness, here comes the robbers. It looks like they're 3 brothers because they're all just as ugly as each other. And they're so big and they're so mean looking. Everybody hide, everybody hide, everybody hide." Well, do you know what happened? The fire in that house had burned out. And so the cat went over and hid in the ashes in the fireplace. The dog hid behind the door, so if anybody came in and opened the door, they wouldn't see that dog. The other animals went outside, and the donkey hid on the porch behind a swing that was on the porch. The cow hid down in some bushes in the yard. The little old rooster hid on top of the house behind the chimney, and Jack climbed up in a tree. All of a sudden, the robbers heard noises, and they saw movement around their house. And all of a sudden, they began to say to one another, "Somebody's in our house. Somebody's in our house. See, somebody's in. See, they were not very smart robbers. And two of them said to the little one, "Go up there and see what's happened in our house, and we'll stay back here where it's safe." And so the little brother robber had to go check things out. He went walking up to the house. As they went to hide, Jack had blown out the candles, and so it was dark in there. It was so dark that robber had to feel to see if his eyes were open or shut. And he went in the house, in the house, in the house. He couldn't see anything. He looked at the fireplace. He thought, if only the fire hadn't gone out, I could put some wood on the fire and it would blaze up. And he went over to the fireplace and he was going to blow and see if there were some coals in the fire. And when he blew ashes right in the cat's eyes. And that cat came claws first out of the fireplace, and it started scratching him in the face, and he started screaming and turning and running. And as he ran for the door, the dog came out from behind the door, and it bit him right on his behind. And as he ran across the porch, the donkey came out from behind the swing, and it kicked him out into the yard in the air. And before he landed, the cow came out from the bushes and caught him on her horns and threw him way out in the woods. And the little rooster jumped on top of the chimney and started crowing. And Jack started laughing so hard he just about fell out of the tree. Well, that little robber hit the ground. He started run. He got to his brother and said, "Come on, let's get out of here. Run, let's go. And all three of them ran. They ran till they couldn't even run anymore. And they just flopped down on the ground. And the big robber said to the little brother, "What was it?" He said, "We can't ever go back to our house again. Monsters have moved in there." There was a little tiny one in the fireplace. It had huge claws, and it was determined to scratch my eyes out. There was another one behind the door, and it must have two heads because it had so many teeth. It must have had two heads, and it just bit me all over, so I ran out the door. There was one on the porch, and it had terrible hooves. Maybe it had 6 legs, I don't know, but it kicked me way out in the yard. And there was a big, gigantic one in the yard, and it caught me on the horns, and it threw me way out in the woods. And I'm so glad it threw me in the woods. I'm so glad it did. They said, "Why?" He said, "Because there was a little ugly one on top of the house, and it kept screaming, 'Throw him up here too, throw him up here too, throw him up here too.' We can't ever go back there again." And those robbers kept running, and they never came back. Well, Jack gathered up his animal friends, and they went back in that house, and they curled up and they slept for the night. And the next day, they went down to the little town, and they went to find the sheriff. You know, the sheriff is like the policeman. And they found the sheriff, and they said, "Sheriff, we think we have found a robber's hideout. Come and see what we found." And the sheriff went with them up to that little house. And when he got inside, and in one corner, he saw money. And in one corner, he saw silver and gold. And in one corner, he saw diamonds and jewels. And in one corner, he saw brand new toys that hadn't even been played with. He looked at Jack and he said, "Jack, you have found a fortune." And Jack said, Oh, so this is what a fortune is." And the sheriff said, "Yes, Jack, and here's the good news. We have been trying to find those robbers and get rid of them for such a long time. Your reward is you get to keep all the things you found." And do you know what Jack did? The animals stayed right there and waited for him. And he went back home and got his mama. And he said, Mama, you got to come with me. I found my fortune, and it's too big to bring home. She says, oh, Jack, let's go see. And he brought his mama back to that house. And he and his mama and those 5 animals lived there. As far as we know, they could still be there to this very day. Well, by then my grandmother would have finished telling the story. And sometimes the sun might have gone down and it might be dark. And you know what might have also happened? Some of us might have fallen asleep, and she might have to carry some of us back to the house. So you see, I started hearing that story when I was so little that I never even stayed awake all the way through it. And then I heard it so many times that I made such pictures in my head, such pictures that, see, to tell the story now, I just think about those pictures and I tell you those pictures so that you might see them too. Now, you might have heard a story like that because all over the world there are folk tales like the one I just told you. In the folklore world, that story is called Animals in the Night Dwelling. And there are versions of it in China. The version my grandmother told came from Scotland and from Wales, where her family came from. You may have heard a version called the Brementown Musicians that was collected in Germany. And the reason you might have heard of that one was because it probably was the first version of this story that was put in a book. But there's so many of them, and it passed down through the years. And my grandmother didn't learn it from a book. She heard it from her grandmother and her grandmother and her grandmother, all the way back to long ago in the countries of Scotland and Wales where they lived. So maybe you'll learn this story, and maybe you'll tell it yourself. And your version will not be like mine. It will not be like any book, because it will be made from the pictures in your head, and your pictures will not be like the pictures seen in the imagination of anybody else. Have a wonderful time at Summer Reading Program, and I'm glad to have had a chance to have a little visit with you on this day. So long.